The fact that the postmodernists dare to be Marxist is also something that I find, I would say, not so much intellectually reprehensible as morally repugnant. And one of the things that the postmodern neo-Marxists continually claim is that they have nothing but compassion for the downtrodden. And I would say that anybody with more than a cursory knowledge of 20th century history who dares to claim simultaneously that they have compassion for the downtrodden and that they're Marxists are revealing either an ignorance of history that's so astounding that it's actually a form of miracle, or a kind of malevolence that's so reprehensible that it's almost unspeakable. Because we already ran the equity experiment over the course of the 20th century, and we already know what the Marxist doctrines have done for oppressed people all around the world. And the answer to that mostly was imprison them, enslave them, work them to death, or execute them. And as far as I can tell, that's not precisely commensurate with any message of compassion. And so I don't think that the postmodern neo-Marxists have a leg to stand on ethically or intellectually or emotionally. And I think that they should be gone after as hard as possible from an intellectual perspective, an informed intellectual perspective. And this is fundamentally a war of ideas. And that's the level of analysis that it should be fought upon. And not only is it a war of ideas, I think it's one that can be won, because I think that especially the French intellectual postmodernists are a pack of, what would you call them? Well, we could start with charlatans. That's a good one. Pseudo-intellectual would be good. Resentful would be another. And then I would also consider them they're highly deceptive in their intellectual strategies, because almost all of them were Marxist student intellectuals, and they knew by the time the Gulag Archipelago came out, and even before that, that the nightmares of the Soviet Union and Maoist China were of such magnitude that they had completely invalidated any claim to ethical justification that the fundamental Marxist doctrines had ever managed to manifest. And so it's a no-go zone as far as I'm concerned. Intellectually, the game's over. We've already figured out that there are finite constraints on interpretation, and we also understand why those exist and how they evolved. And from the perspective of political argumentation, there's absolutely no excuse whatsoever in the 21st century to put forth Marxist doctrines as if they're the bomb that's needed by the compassionate and the bomb that's administered by the compassionate to the downtrodden. Sorry, tried that, didn't work. We got 100 million corpses to prove it, and that's plenty for me. And if it's not enough for you, well then you should do some serious thinking, either about your historical knowledge or about your moral character. So that's the first thing.
Now, as far as the Soviet Union is concerned, I didn't happen to talk about it tonight, but I've written about this topic. I haven't just made the charge. I've written about it and explained why I think it's true. And it doesn't bother me if I happen to agree with the mainstream media on this. Trotsky, to pick somebody who you remember, once he was charged in the 1930s with agreeing with the fascists in his condemnation of the Soviet Union. And he pointed out that his critique was to be true. He wasn't going to abandon it if somebody else happened to say it for different reasons. So the question is about the Soviet Union, and particularly about Lenin. So what was Leninism? Well, here we have to look at the facts. Now, you look at the facts, I think here's what you find. Lenin was a right-wing deviation of the socialist movement, and he was so regarded. He was regarded as that by the Marxists, by the mainstream Marxists. We've forgotten who the mainstream Marxists were because they lost, and you only remember the guys who won. But if you go back to that period, the mainstream Marxists were people like, for example, Anton Pannekoek, who was head of education for the Marxist movement, and he's one of the people who Lenin later denounced as an infantile leftist. But he was one of the leading intellectuals of the actual Marxist movement. Rosa Luxemburg was another mainstream Marxist, and there were others. And they were very critical. In fact, Trotsky was one up until 1917. They were all very critical of Leninism because of this, what they regarded as this opportunistic vanguardism. The idea that the radical intelligentsia were going to exploit popular movements to seize state power and then to use that state power to whip the population into the society that they chose. Now, that was quite inconsistent with Marxism as understood by the mainstream sort of, I'd say, left Marxists. From this point of view, Bolshevism was a right-wing deviation. Trotsky made the same points up till 1917. Now, when Lenin came back to Russia in April 1917, he took a different line, quite a different line from the one he'd had in the past. You take a look at Lenin's work, it shifted character in April 17. In April 1917, it became kind of libertarian. That's when he came out with the April Theses, and that's when he wrote State and Democracy. It came out a year later, but that's when it was written. And these were State and Revolution. These were basically libertarian works. They were very much more in the mainstream of sort of left libertarian socialism, from sort of this range that goes from anarchism over to left Marxism of the Pannekoek-Luxemburg variety. And he talked about Soviets and the need for a workers' organization and so on. And in fact, came really closer to what the essence of socialism was always understood to be. After all, the core of socialism was understood to be workers' control over production. That was the core. That's where you begin with. Then you go on to other things. But the beginning is control by the workers over production. That's where it begins. Then Lenin took power in October 1917 in what's called a revolution, but in my view ought to be called a coup. And things followed that coup, or revolution, if you want to call it that. One of the things that followed it was the immediate moves to destroy the Soviets and the factory councils. Those were some of the first moves of Lenin and Trotsky after they took, Trotsky joined at that point, after they took state power. In fact, if you look at what Lenin wrote after that period, or did, you'll find it's a reversion to the earlier position. This sort of left deviation is that, a deviation. You could ask why. In my view, it was just opportunistic. He knew that in order to gain power, he was going to have to go along with the popular currents that were developing, which were in fact spontaneous and libertarian and socialist, as most popular movements have been, in fact, since the 17th century. And being an astute politician, which he was, he sort of went along with that and talked the line that the people wanted to hear. It's just like when an American politician goes somewhere and his pollsters tell him, say so-and-so, and he says it, doesn't mean he believes it. And I think Lenin was doing the same thing without polls. In any event, whatever your interpretation is, when he took power, he reverted to the former vanguardism and moved at once to eliminate the organs of workers' control. Now that meant he was moving to destroy socialism, if socialism has as its core workers' control over production. The Soviets and the factory councils were instruments of workers' control. And same, you could say they're defective instruments, maybe worked out better and so on, yeah, no doubt. But they were the instruments that had been developed in the course of popular struggle to implement basically workers' control, and those were the first things to go. By early 1918, it's still really before the Civil War set in, Lenin's view was pretty clearly expressed. It was the view that both he and Trotsky took the position that what you need is what Trotsky called a labor army, which is submissive to the control of a single leader. He said modern progress and development and socialism requires that the mass of the population subordinate themselves to a single leader in a disciplined workforce. Well, that has absolutely nothing to do with socialism. In fact, it's the exact opposite of it, and was criticized for that by in a spirit of some solidarity, because the revolutionary forces were still operative. He was criticized for that by people like Rosa Luxemburg and by Pannekoek and Gorter and the other mainstream sort of left Marxists, and I think they were right. It seems to me that, and then it just goes on from there. I mean, Lenin reconstructed the czarist systems of oppression often more efficiently, Cheka, KGB, and other techniques of control and oppression. I think from that point on, there was nothing remotely like socialism in the Soviet Union. I think it was, in fact, in my view, it was a precursor of later forms of totalitarianism. Now, you could, that's what I think happened, and I think that's what you discover if you look at the facts. Now, why is it called socialism? Well, I think I think that's complicated, and we should look at it. The Soviet Union calls it socialism, and after they took control of they did take control pretty soon of most of the international socialist movement, because primarily of the prestige of having created something sort of socialism. Incidentally, just a side remark, Lenin remained, despite it all, a sort of an orthodox Marxist in many respects. And as an orthodox Marxist, he didn't believe that it was possible to have socialism in the Soviet Union. This was supposed to be, up to his death, or shortly before his death, when he was still writing, speaking lucidly, he kept the view that the Soviet revolution was a holding action. They were just going to hold things in place until the real revolution took place in Germany, because the revolution, according to Marx's doctrine, was going to take place in the most advanced sector of modern industrial capitalism, for all the reasons that you read about in Marx. That's where the revolution had to take place. Obviously, that wasn't the Soviet Union, so there couldn't be socialism there. It was just some kind of holding action. And that presumably gave some sort of justification for eliminating the socialist institutions. I don't think it's a real justification, but probably that was the internal justification. And again, in taking that view, he was in accord with the mainstream Marxist tradition. Well, after that comes the view that all of this is socialism. And why should the communist parties take that view? I think the reason is because they wanted to sort of exploit the moral force of socialism, which was quite real. It's kind of hard to remember that today, but at that time it was very real. This was regarded as a, as a progressive moral force, and by associating their own destruction of socialism with the aura of socialism, they hoped to gain credit in the working classes and other progressive sectors. Now, the West also identified that with socialism, and they did it for the opposite reason. They wanted to associate socialism with the brutality of the Russian state that undermined socialism. So what you had is that the two major world propaganda agencies, for their own and quite different reasons, were claiming that this is socialism, that this destruction of socialism is socialism. And it's very hard to break out of the control of the world's two major propaganda agencies when they agree. They agreed for different reasons, but they basically agreed, and that then became doctrine and dogma. Well, I think people should ask whether that's true. Take a look back and see whether the moves that Lenin took and that Trotsky supported him in taking and that they both advocated had anything to do with socialism as it was understood by, say, in the Marxist tradition or in the left libertarian tradition. And I think the answer that you'll discover when you look at that is that they didn't. In fact, this was a destruction of socialist institutions. Well, this may be true or it may be false, but if it's true, and I think the evidence pretty strongly supports it, then I don't see any reason why we shouldn't express that fact. And I certainly don't think that we should be deterred in expressing this fact if other people who's, fascists or whatever, happen to condemn the Soviet Union, just for the same reasons that Trotsky mentioned in the 1930s. We should recognize what I think is true. I've written about it plenty myself, that the Bolshevik revolution, so-called revolution, it was really a coup, was really a counter-revolution, which placed state power in the hands of a highly authoritarian, anti-socialist group, which within a couple of months had destroyed the factory councils, had destroyed the Soviets, had dismissed the Constituent Assembly because they knew they were going to lose, and had eliminated every popular movement, and had done exactly what Trotsky said, turned the country into a labor army under the control of the maximal leader. That was mid-1918. I mean, since then, there hasn't been a shred of socialism in the Soviet Union. Now, of course, they called it socialism, but they also called it democracy. They were people's democracies, the purest form of democracy. They were socialism. The left, the West, the big propaganda system in the world, of course, just laughed at the democracy part, but it loved the socialism part, because that's a way to defame socialism. So if you think that the fall of the Soviet Union is a blow to socialism, you ought to also think on the same grounds that it's a blow to democracy. After all, they call themselves democracies too, so why isn't it a blow to democracy? Makes as much sense. It's only when it gets filtered through the Western propaganda system that it's not a blow to democracy, but it is a blow to socialism. But, there's absolutely no reason to play that game, whether you play it in dissent or in the nation or on the right or anywhere else. Expose it for the fraud that it is.
His comment that the ideology was flawed.
What ideology? The ideology of totalitarianism? Yeah, it's deeply flawed. I mean, they were the initial modern totalitarians. It has nothing to do with socialism. They destroyed socialism within weeks. They didn't wait. By 1918, it was finished. And they knew it, like it's not a secret. They knew it. I mean, in fact, Lenin, as soon as he sort of got grips of things, after he said, he moved to what he called state capitalism. That's what it was. It had nothing to do with socialism. Socialism, I mean, you can argue about what, there's no point arguing what the word means, but what it always meant at the core was that producers take control of production. You know, working people take control of production, what's sometimes called industrial democracy. That was the absolute core of it. Well, you know, there was more socialism in Germany, in Western Europe, than there was in Russia. You know, Russia's about the most anti-socialist place you can imagine since 1918. Had wage labor, had super exploitation, had no element of workers' control or involvement or participation. And that's just pure, you know, what's it got to do with socialism? It's the exact opposite on every point. As I say, the West liked to call that socialism while laughing at the fact that they called themselves Democrats. But that's for purely propaganda reasons. I mean, unless you're committed to being part of the Western propaganda system, there's nothing to say about that issue of dissent except to laugh.